Can I move this over a little bit, or is that going to affect it too much? Maybe it's too bad. Yeah, it's fine, actually. Yeah, it's fine. Yeah.
It's better, I think.
Is that better? Yeah. Okay. Let's see if this will do its thing. Great. Hello, everyone. So, as Anne said, I'm Jenny. I'm based at the University of Warwick. I just finished my PhD, and I'm currently applying for jobs and also helping on this project, and I'm holding a fellowship at Warwick at the moment. So basically, my role in the research was conducting the literature review. So as I was based in the UK, I had access to a lot of anthropological sources and also more recent scholarship that's been written from African and also European authors. So I focus mostly in this presentation on kind of the framing in the literature of woman-to-woman marriage and how the understanding has shifted over time. And what I'm arguing is that actually the care and social reproduction perspective offers a new frame by which we could understand it. And I think that it actually acts as an important critique on the frames that have been put forward so far. So initially, we had an anthropological literature that developed alongside colonization. So the way that colonial authorities used anthropologists to understand local customs, and that heavily influenced the position of colonial authorities on woman marriage. And then following, they developed more, academic anthropological literature that wasn't so closely tied with colonialism, that developed its own frames. And then we have feminist anthropological and political economy perspectives coming through in the 1980s, focusing on women's position within marriages, their power and agency, rather than focusing on the kinship structures that really dominated the anthropological literature. And basically, since the 1990s, there hasn't been much empirical scholarship on woman-to-woman marriage. There has been legal judgments and cases, and in fact, that's partly the inspiration for Anne's work, because that's really the most recent literature that we have, because the last kind of major texts were written in the late 1980s. So what I focus, though, on is the literature that was written on more social science literature, because I think what's been presented so far has focused more on the legal aspects. So, right. So initially, as I said, the views of colonial officials on woman-to-woman marriage really viewed it as a form of prostitution and slavery, and they had a very negative view of the practice. In particular, this has influenced judicial decision-making in some contexts, such as Nigeria, this idea of it being a repugnant practice associated, so for instance, this colonial official, Frederick Lugard, wrote that because it was seen that the older woman acquires absolute ownership over the younger woman, over her labor, over her whole self, there was kind of a sense that actually, how is this marriage? Because they also didn't recognize marriage between two women at that point. So in the views of anthropologists, the function of woman-to-woman marriage, later on in the 1950s, there was some anthropological work that was done that looked at the function of woman-to-woman marriage in kinship structures. So looking at the way that it resolves the problem of barrenness, the idea of adopting sex roles, the way that a woman seems to be taking on the position of a man in these marriages, and the idea that it really reflected the academic thinking of the time, which was obsessed with kinship structure. The anthropological debates were very much on how these marriages enabled patrilineal structures to continue, and also how marriage could be conceptualized. So there was fierce debates in the European anthropological literature around, do we need sexual differentiation for it to be a marriage? Does there need to be an element in which the older woman plays the husband role for it to be considered a marriage? Because it was difficult for them to conceptualize the idea of where there's not strong differentiation between the masculine and the feminine components. I'm just going to grab a drink of water. No, it's fine. Great. So essentially, there's more authors, but these are some influential texts from the early anthropological/colonial period. As I said, Frederick Lugard, who wrote The Dual Mandate in British Tropical Africa, really emphasized, he wrote two pages essentially on woman-to-woman marriage, where it was referred to as a slavish practice. Melville Herskovits came along in the 1930s as an anthropologist and really suggested that these were about a sexual relationship between women and thereby was deemed as immoral. But that was his contribution, even though he didn't really have any evidence that that was the case. But that was his Western perception. And then Edward Evans Pritchard, who you might have heard of as a very eminent anthropologist who really influenced the discourse. And he looked at the way that woman-to-woman marriage basically was a fix for the problem of barrenness, and he looked at specifically the issue of sex roles. So interestingly, in kind of the 1960s and 70s, with the rise of the women's movement and feminist thinking coming to the fore, a new frame on woman-to-woman marriage developed that really critiqued some of the assumptions that were going on in that kind of very white male-driven discourse that was initially there. So the focus of those texts was really on women's access to property, which is still a theme that's very important. The relationship between woman-to-woman marriage and the status and political power of women, and also the assessment of whether it's disempowering or whether it's empowering. So different authors had different stances on that. So probably one of the most influential feminist anthropologist is Eileen Jensen Kriege, who worked, she wrote this in 1947. She was an anthropologist who looked at the Lavadu in southern Africa, and basically she really critiqued those male-dominant anthropological perspectives, and so she really critiqued Herskovits around the allegation of homosexuality in these marriages, and she also critiqued Evans Pritchard as seeing barrenness as the key driving factor, because she really emphasized the power of women and women's agency in entering into these marriages. So she also said, in the Lavadu, which is a matrilineal society, she saw that woman-to-woman marriage was critical for political power and status. And so she identified actually 4 different contexts and driving rationales for woman-to-woman marriage: political, economic, legal, and social. So in some instances, it was calling on the right to a daughter-in-law or to generate a political heir, or also to resolve the problem of barrenness, but that was like one factor among many, I guess you could say. So following on, Kriege really influenced the literature in a huge way, and in the 1970s and 80s, feminist anthropologists and political economists really drew on her in a significant way. So Christine Abo, for instance, really critiqued this idea in social anthropology that women are just seen as kind of cogs in male society. So the idea that woman-to-woman marriage essentially maintains patrilineality, where she sees that it enabled women to gain access to property and to have places of power in the community, and that she really emphasized also the different motives for entering woman-to-woman marriage, that it wasn't homogenous at all. So interestingly, she notes, she was looking at the Kamba in Kenya, and she notes that the role of different jural arrangements within societies which shape why women enter into it and kind of what the benefits are, which is very much what David was saying about kind of the different arrangements that we see in Kenya between different communities. So Regina Oboler is probably one of the most influential in the kind of the later movement, and she drew on Kriege, and she saw that actually woman-to-woman marriage was a flexible institution which enabled women to respond to socioeconomic change. So she saw that actually there was a radical increase in woman marriage after colonialism in response to the disinheriting of women from land. So for instance, the Swinnerton Plan in the British colonial state, which basically gave men the titles to land, had really disempowered women. And so she notes a real increase in women entering into these marriages because they felt disinherited. So So following on from that, Eva Tobeson looks at marriage among the Kuria in Tanzania, and so does Bart Roswara. And both of them focus on the way that, in a sense, it's not really about a woman becoming a man, but it's about there's actually flexibility in the gender. So there's a sense in which women might have male adopt some aspects of male rights, so in order to hold property or inherit, but also they're also treated as mothers, so not as men. So there's kind of ambivalence and fluidity. Very much Bart Roswara says that the idea of woman marriage has really misrepresented them because it's really about the right to a daughter-in-law. And I think that's possibly very true among the Kuria at least. So finally, Ife Amadium from Nigeria very much emphasized the flexibility of woman-to-woman marriage as a flexible gender system, but significantly the way that the colonial view of woman-to-woman marriage has really affected its place in Nigeria as kind of, I think that especially this has been reflected in the jurisprudence, which has tended to be much more negative than it has been in Kenya or Tanzania. And she said it's really this idea of the male role is really not, shouldn't be the focus, and that really reflects Western obsessions about sex roles rather than the reality. So kind of where are we now? So as I said, there's been no major empirical study since the 1980s. And really the debates, even in the 1980s, focused on these kind of binaries around kinship structure, but also women's agency within that. And then kind of, is it empowering? Is it disempowering? I mean, Eva Tobeson talked about, at the end of the day, it's disempowering because it's just perpetuating a patriarchal property system. Even though they're kind of an exception to the rule, it's not really changing the structure that much. Whereas Christine Abo saw a lot of agency for women. So there's different perspectives on that. And again, property and status have been the key lenses that we've seen this through. So what I argue is that the question of care adds actually a new framing that kind of tilts, while still maintaining questions of property and status in the equation, and also the idea of patrilineality and all those questions. It doesn't remove them, but it adds a new kind of approach to thinking about woman-to-woman marriage. And I think it creates different kinds of research questions. So instead of saying, so to what extent do women have control over property, the question is, what kind of sociality does their control over property enable? What kind of relationality does it produce? And so the idea of, it could offer up, as we've talked about in the last couple of days, this idea that as woman-to-woman marriage, if their legal recognition moves away from it as just a cultural practice, but actually as related to the rights of the elderly, then actually it could create a new dimension in the legal debates as well. So that's really it. But I think there's a lot of new potential for understanding woman-to-woman marriage through the lens of care. Thanks.
You still had 2 minutes. Now we're going to have Catherine, aren't we?
As she looks, good morning. As she looks for my very few slides, allow me to thank Stuart and the group for inviting me to be here. I don't know how she found me on the internet, I guess.
We found your article.
We found your article, and then we tracked you down the results.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm actually very pleased to be here. My name is Catherine Kitetu. I have been a lecturer in Egerton University. And in the last 4 years, I worked in the county government of Nakuru as a CC County Executive Committee member or in charge of public service management. Now, maybe some will ask me on the side there, what am I doing at the county? I'm a researcher, for goodness sake. I think after many years of doing research and everything, I feel like our researches are being put on the shelf, and I want to really know what's on the ground. Anyway, this paper I wrote just before I got into the county, and because I have only
20 minutes.
Okay, because I have only 20 minutes, but I won't say much. I'd like to just not say too much about the research because they seem to have already dealt with what I did in this research. Now, I would like also to recognize a colleague. She's in USIU. She's called Angelina Kioko. And I'm a linguist, or that's my area of research. I'm not a first language speaker of Kamba, which I'm going to talk about. And so I needed another person who's a first language speaker who can then begin to give me the true meanings. Although I understand them, having been married there for quite a number of years now, I knew I needed somebody to give me the really meaning. Now, so much has been spoken by this wonderful group, and I don't want to therefore go to the same because it's really related, very much the same, and I'll show the slides very quickly because what they've said is what I really wanted to say. And maybe towards the end, very quickly, problematize the use of language because that's my area. I'm beginning to think, even as we've talked since yesterday, that the very term woman-to-woman marriage is actually misplaced. Now, I used it in my paper and in my research, but it doesn't fit. And unfortunately, in our research, we didn't go into checking just, what do you call it? Although the Kambas, at least the ones I worked with, they didn't give me the word that they actually call this marriage, if it is a marriage. So there are a lot of issues and questions about marriage and woman to woman. Exactly what should we call this institution? So those are some of the issues. Now I want to be able to give answers, but we'll see how we go. So very quickly, I'm going to look at just about 4 points. Hey, I don't know how to work this. Somebody please. I want to get to the next slide. How do I go?
Just go. Yeah.
Oh.
Just use these ones.
Okay, thanks. So I'm going to mention very quickly about the study we did. But I will also talk about that bit of language, the importance of language. And a bit of what has already been said anyway about the benefits of the older woman in being in this arrangement and also the younger woman in being in this arrangement. And then the challenges that we thought were there in this kind of arrangement. Now, we said, and it has been said already, that this practice is actually not just in Kenya, but almost around Africa. I found, of course, colleagues in Nigeria, I think also in South Africa. In Kenya, also the Kikuyu, by the way, you didn't mention them, but they also practice the same. It's very silent. And that's why I say there that sometimes it's very discreet, and then it's sometimes a bit stigmatized. And I'll talk about that stigmatization later on. Now, I used, the methods of study we used were really in-depth. So I used 2 women who I sat with and interviewed and tried to understand how they came to be in this arrangement. Our initial thought was really not to talk about care. I was interested, being a foreigner in Ukambani, to try and understand, you have what? This marriage? So I never heard about it. Well, growing up in Nairobi and everything, so never mind. I never heard about that. So I was just interested. How do you get to be married by another woman, quote unquote, for lack of a better word? And so we went in to understand the practice and to document and to just, catch the thinking of these women about how did they come to this, what were the causes. And fortunately for me, I don't need to go into so many other details because they have been mentioned, that mainly it was about barrenness, normally, and so on and so forth. Now, I did mention there that the practice of the Iweto, I liked a term. I called it the Iweto marriage because the woman, the younger woman who's married, she's called Iweto in Kikamba. So I called it the Iweto marriage, again for lack of a better term. That it involves, and they have mentioned it, it involves marriage negotiation, payment of dowry, custody of children, payment. All those things are normally talked about in this kind of institution. I was thinking that after maybe 2, maybe 3 centuries of Kenyans interacting with different groups, that some of those practices could have died, but they haven't. In fact, they are getting more prevalent. So I said in that slide that despite the many centuries of social, political, religious influences from outside Kenya, the Iweto marriage is still practiced. Why? And maybe that's where your bit comes into you, to inject into mine, to begin to look at the real issues that bring people to this kind of arrangement. Now, as a linguist, myself and my friend Angelina, we looked at the nouns. What do you call this? What do you call this woman? What do you call this one who was married? And so on and so forth. And it seems that to a large extent, the word wife, the word husband, the word marriage itself has broader meanings than what we have in the textbooks. And I think I'll have to do more research, because from what I've learned today and yesterday is that there's quite a bit about something in our language that sometimes we take for granted, and we quickly rush and say, okay, they're married. Are they? What are they really doing? So Iweto marriage touches on unique issues of unwritten traditional practices, which has implications for the right of children, for my colleagues who are lawyers here, and also the wives, the so-called wives in these WTW marriages. Now, in our study, we looked at, like I've said, the language and so on. And I want to mention this because they are very important in that particular. I don't want to bore you with linguistics, but just for information. The word Iweto was very key. Now, Iweto is a word that is derived from a verb kuweta, and they told me it is to mention, to gossip, to talk, not in high tones, just talk quietly. And that's why I say it is a bit discreet, because after living with my people, the ones who've married me for like 20-something years, I never had, because it's talked quietly. And so the arrangement is talked about quietly. People know it and they just leave it at that. It is accepted. It is accepted, and for them, actually, when we went, I had other informants, 60-year-olds and above. When I went to ask them, so how does this happen? They were like, where have you been all your life? Why are you asking? It was like so obvious. Why are you asking? So, okay. So Iweto, Mwaitu, somebody mentioned. Mother-in-law, mother. I call my mother-in-law Mwaitu. I'm not an Iweto. But okay, she's mother. And this is a very, very strong term. I think those who are Kamba speakers, first language speakers, may also want to say something about this. But Mwaitu is not as disempowered as we usually talk about women in Kenya. And that also came from a previous study I did when I did my PhD, that where there's quite a lot of gender differentiation and gender discrimination and all that, there are instances where a woman has quite some bit of power, and Mwaitu begins to belong to do this. Now, she may not have as much power as the man, but she does have some power. I know, like in my own home, when Mwaitu speaks, Mwaitu has spoken. Everybody has to listen to her, even my father-in-law. So I don't know, that's just our family, but this is now need for more research to find out how all that works out in the rest of the community. Kiveti, wife, nga, can't be used alone. It has to be nga, somebody, meaning daughter of. And the lady we worked with is called, or she was called in the community, nga Mutuku, the daughter of Mutuku, her father, wherever she came from. And the Mwaitu, the mother, the female husband, I don't like that term, but okay, for lack of a better term, called her nga Mutuku, daughter-in-law, my daughter-in-law, the daughter of her father. let me go a bit quickly because some of these things I think have been mentioned. In our interpretation, there was a sense in which Iweto was stigmatized. Now, maybe I'm wrong, because in one instance they really accept this arrangement and it's really honored, by the way. When a younger woman has been brought in, the cows have gone, the goats, and so on and so forth, and all those arrangements have been done, she's actually really accepted and she owns that space. But there was a sense in which there was a bit of stigmatization. I say this because of the whispering. And actually she's never called Aniweto in her hearing. It is just kind of silent. But, you know, if you are talking when she's not there or her mother-in-law is not there, we'll say, you know, she's married as Aniweto. Very interesting. While I was doing this research, I asked my husband, could we give our daughter as Aniweto? He was so scandalized. What do you mean give my daughter as Aniweto? I was saying, well, if it's an accepted institution, why? But now I'll explain why only certain ladies may end up as Iwetos. Now, I've mentioned there that there are issues of power and powerlessness as it is in gender, that Mwetu has some power, but generally, as it is all over Kenya, a woman never has all that power that a man has. So I'll pass that one quickly. And okay, for here and in the issues of care, the Mwetu's authority is limited on day-to-day issues as opposed to a man who can do much more, and we know from the legal issues that were mentioned yesterday, who can do much more without anybody questioning. That is the idea that I was trying to pass here. I'm arguing that we need to look at the language and the terminologies that we use. Why? Because language has the power, has the potential to influence how individuals view themselves and others and how they live their lives. In most cases, we'll find that this language, what we call them or what we call ourselves, is naturalized. It is just common sense. And no wonder when I began to ask them, so how does this work? It's like, it does, you know, and you don't find a lot of explanation. We just leave it that way. We live like that. So language plays an active role in the formation of knowledge, and more, it is mediated by the social context and the conditions of use. Now, there are benefits, and I think these have been mentioned for people in this institution, the Mwetu and Iweto. They were already mentioned, I won't go into that, but ideally, this older lady gets to have sons. The younger woman, normally, and that's why my daughter could not become an Iweto, because usually, as they explained to me, if a girl has children out of wedlock, one or two for whatever reason, or her parents were poor, then she could be given away. So my daughter doesn't qualify because she has a dad who takes care of her, and she hasn't had children yet out of wedlock. And therefore, for us to quickly think, what do we do to save this situation? Because it's about taking care of this girl, and then also it takes care of this older woman who doesn't have the children. So it works on both ways. So I've mentioned some of the benefits there. So, and I think they mentioned that the Iweto gets to have a home and property because it is bequeathed to her. Now, I'm about to end. There are challenges, though, in this kind of institution. While we've talked of care, and this is really important, actually I didn't get married to the whole concept of care. I hadn't thought about it. But while we've talked about care, when we worked with Siombwa or the Ngamtuku, she was kind of free. She was much freer than the other women who were married to men. And in fact, there was a day the Mwetu was actually crippled because she had her leg cut. through diabetes. And so I go to the home, and nobody had cooked for the children of my twin. And I was like, okay, she seems to have some kind of freedom of her own. I wondered about that. But okay, let me just leave it at that. Are there any benefits for the man who does give birth to these children? It is also very silent. Actually, I nagged. I tried to get someone to tell me who is the father of this child. And it is completely silent. Unless in other communities it can be said. It is completely silent. So the man, we decided with my colleague, they seem to understand the wider social role and responsibility of raising children for the Mwaitu. And so it is just left at that. It's a very silent matter. You don't get to know who is the father that the Iweto is bringing to this home. It is silent. They're just part of the home now. And a good thing in that these children get to have a home. In fact, I was talking to somebody yesterday and saying, had we continued to practice our cultural this and that, maybe we wouldn't have so many street children. She told me, okay, maybe not, because some children actually come from good homes. So, I don't know. But generally, the culture, the way I understood it was to make sure everybody belonged somewhere. And of course, the care that we've been talking about in this. There were other challenges, though. The issue of poverty, particularly in this homestead where we worked. In fact, they didn't even have much of a home. And I was going to get my colleagues, the ones we wrote that book with, many of them in England, some of them in South Africa, and so on, to maybe put some money together and do for them a house and a wheelchair for the Mwaitu, because she was just walking on the ground, and it really pained me. But as I was buying the wheelchair myself first, before we go into building the house, she died. So she's not there. And then the following year, the Iweto also died. So yeah, I'm not going to check. This is 5 years down the line. I should have done something to go and check on those children. They were not small. They were like late teenage. So I believe they're doing okay. But they needed to be checked because of the levels of poverty in that particular home. So this matter I've mentioned that generally women, because they are just women anyway, as it is in Kenya all over, they're still discriminated and they still suffer the same things. Now, he mentioned it, I like the way he put it, that they like the resolutions of home when there's a dispute rather than the legal. Because I think the customary way of dealing with the disputes seems to be better to them. Like I discovered, if that Iweto or anybody who's married, I think in the Ukambani community, if I should choose to leave my husband, I can give a goat, and one of these good men will tell me it's called the Mbuisia Ule. Yeah, the goat for refusing and walk away. And the Iweto has the same power. So apart from the illiteracy and everything, but it was easier to deal with the resolutions from the customary side. Now, so in conclusion, before I just get that conclusion and you can read it for yourselves, yes, after I got your email and everything, I looked at this again and I realized, there are issues of care here and very important. And sadly, I'm no legal fellow, so I couldn't understand all the legal jargon in the family law and everything. But I sensed that it was not quite captured in the way I thought it should be captured. But the biggest problem is actually the language we are using. Because for most Kenyans, I guess, when you talk about marriage, it's just what is in the constitution, man, woman, Christian man, it's just easy. So when you come to such an arrangement, what do you call it? And therefore, I don't think, and I think it is you who mentioned, it's not quite in our legal framework in the way the people practice it now. She mentioned yesterday about the court cases that have been and how they managed to judge. But I imagine if they had been coming outside Kenya, maybe they would not have judged that way. But they understand the context, and maybe they judged in favor because of the way they understand the context. So, in short, I'm saying, and as I end, that we need to problematize the word woman to woman. And maybe that's upon us linguists to find the term that actually fits. This is not it. It's not woman to woman. Number two, and somebody mentioned it yesterday, I can't see her today, Professor, whatever her name, can't remember it. She mentioned that we need to go to the ground and bring these stories up rather than coming from up, going down. And I think even to get the proper names for our legal framework, it will have to come from the people. Exactly what should we call this? And then how should we package it so that we can deal with care and the issue that we've been talking about without messing it up by bringing our own understanding of things. So, my conclusion. The woman-to-woman marriage is an institution that has existed for long. It didn't start in the 1900s. I think it has been there like forever. It has been there for a long time. And in a way, woman-to-woman marriage, again, for lack of a better word, does provide the care for the elderly, because women do get taken care of by those women. And these women also do get the benefits of having land and so on. By the way, it is called Mbe. Even I have. Because a woman, when she's married in Ukambani, when that procedure has taken place, she's given her Mbe. Is that it? There's a plot that you've drawn. This is yours now. And she holds it in custody for her sons. And that's why when you don't get sons, you have to find somebody so that they can inherit that. At least that's the understanding I have. Now, issues of extreme poverty, ignorance of the law, traditional punishments, which sometimes are not working because of the changing context that we live in, the shaming that used to be there, that if the Iweto, like I found Mutuku not taking care that day, there are ways of shaming her so that she gets back in line. But those ones are getting a little bit not as strong as they used to be. So, really, I should just thank you and end.
Thank you very much. I think we'll forgive her. She made a point of not looking in my direction, so all my Thank you very much. I do hope we have time for discussion. We do until 11. Okay, so we have 20 minutes. By that clock, 27 minutes for discussion. There's just a lot that's been presented here. And I'll be a bit unfair as a chair and start by giving you 2 points. You can see I was having a hard time. She can come to the front. Oh, sorry. Yeah, if we come over here, if we sit in the front. And can everyone hear me from here? I don't need to. Shall I bring it to the mic? Yeah. I was having a hard time sticking to my role as chair. Because I'm very much invested in the issue myself. So I'm taking notes and I'm trying to listen and also watch the clock. That was a bit of a bit hard. But I think I'll just share 2 thoughts and then we can open it up. And the one thought has raised itself repeatedly about terminology, and I'm glad that we ended with Catherine's presentation. because that was already going on in my mind, and I'm sure in a lot of people's minds here, about the naming of what it is you're observing. Okay? I want to suggest that maybe with this research project, you develop your own lexicon, that's sensitive to each particular community. What is the term that is used there? And even there you have to distinguish between the self-ascription, the terms used among the women themselves. How do they refer to each other? That's what Kathleen did. And then what is the third person reference? When someone is talking about her, about the Ngambu people, what do they call her? And so I'm a first language speaker of Kikamba. And of course, it was exactly the way she talked about it, that it's about mentioning, or the one who is mentioned, the one who is talked about, which gives you a sense that there's some kind of stigma attached to the way other people look at it. But even there, you have to break it down. So who still thinks of it as stigma? Who thinks of it as something that's quite acceptable? On the stigma thing, I just started feeling a bit. You talked about evidence of stigma in the fact that people do not want it for their own daughters. Like you gave the example of your husband, unless they think you haven't got other options, right? Well, there are other ways, there are other examples of stigma, and one is in the pop culture. I can think of at least 2 popular songs in Kikamba from around the late 70s or the early 80s that talked about this. Who remembers Kakai Kilonzo, the musician? Are there any Kambas here? You know the music of Kakai Kilonzo, right? There's one song where he talks about, he's advising younger women, don't ever agree to be married as an Iweto. And then he talks about, how a thin blanket, you'll always feel cold, find a husband, get married, something like that. Anyway, so the pop culture indicates there's some kind of stigma. And then I'll tell you, my dad's youngest uncle, his wife, my aunt, I just call her that though she's a great aunt, really speaking, she took on an Iweto. Actually, a girl who was just about maybe 2 or 3 years my senior in primary school. And she dropped out at primary school level. So I know, okay? So my aunt takes her on as her Iweto. Now my aunt was active in the church, the local church there, the Africa Inland Church. So what happens? Both she and her husband get excommunicated from church because it's seen as a practice that is not compatible with monogamous Christian marriage. So that, right there you can see that there is clearly a section of society that doesn't see it as something that's right. There's stigma there. So people will have taken these actions after having seriously weighed the consequences. I'm sure she knew what would happen. And it did happen. Now, many years later, she was restored to fellowship. I don't know on what terms, because this lady is still there. She came with 2 sons. Now she added several more. I don't know how many more. I've lost track. But those 2 that she came with are grown up and married, and they have their children. So she has grandchildren now. But somehow she got restored in church. So just things that show how the community views the practice. And that it's contested, There are different sections that will view it differently. Okay. The other thing I wanted to talk about is, you see, the reason why this team is talking about this practice is because they're looking at what are the existing ways in communities in which people are trying to deal with providing care for the elderly, and what kind of it's like a social contract of sorts, I'll provide care for you, and then I have a guarantee that I will get access to land or cattle, whatever property, so that I'm also secure in my old age. The kind of a social contract. That's the reason why we're looking at it, And so we can look at the whole variety of other arrangements that people have for caring for the elderly, so that we inform policy, okay? So that's the ideal we're looking for. But there's a problem. When you make a practice that is understood in its own terms, it has its own logic among the people who practice it, okay? When you make it visible to the state always has distorted vision. It will never present that thing in the way that you saw it, And Agnes, Dr. Miroka gave the example of land registration. We've had this program since the Swinnerton Plan, 1955, going on in different parts of the country, came in at different points. The earliest was in central Kenya. In Makueni, it came in 1960, around 68, 69, In different parts of the country, it has a different time period. But the state comes in, and people have been told, okay, we're coming to register the piece of land that you own, okay? Already there's a problem, okay? Because there are some types of land on which it's very clear you can call something, ownership, okay? So the ancestral land or the homestead where you live and there's the farm where everyone knows you use. But there are also other pieces of land where people have shared use. So, like your pasture land. Until very recently, there was shared pasture. And it was understood who used it at different seasons. Even now, we have a lot of seasonal rivers in Mukambani, let's say. So during the dry season, you have to invest quite a lot of labor in digging for the water, okay? That's the only time you'll see fences on the riverbed. Because I've invested in digging that, I fence it off. And no one else will use it but my family or someone who's got permission for me. So all those temporary kind of or shared kinds of use, how do you register that? So now you began to have the contest full of disputes. Someone fences off a large piece and says, this is mine, but how is it yours? But the state will come and, okay, fence off, it's yours. If no one can challenge you, it will get registered as yours. So the state has come with this distorted vision and changed customary ownership altogether, leading to what she was talking about, people ending up landless, even though they had land before. So we have to be careful. That's why the naming is important, first of all. Yeah? What are we telling the state this is? Okay? And then when the state gets involved and processes through its own lenses, comes out with something at the end, we may not like what we see, okay? So we have to be quite careful. I don't know what solution we'll have to that. But maybe argue for recognition of social contracts that are already in the discussing community, okay? And then give flexibility to informal institutions. Let's say now when the elders or the chiefs resolve a dispute and they make a determination, the court should simply adopt that, rather than try to analyze it through the repugnancy test or have a structured recognition of we're talking about that this morning with Onyango, about when you have alternative dispute resolution that originates in the informal forum itself. Can the court simply, on the face of having satisfied itself that this went through arbitration with the elders, yes, it's agreed, we just adopt it as it is. Okay, we don't start trying to say, oh, but this is repugnant, oh, but this is two women together, oh, but this is... No, you just honor what already is there as long as there's agreement. Anyway, so just some of my thoughts. Yeah, don't take so long to explain them. Okay, we'll open up. We still have just under 20 minutes of discussion. I think in the first instance we can take 5 questions, pause for them to respond, and then so that we have time for another round of 5. Okay, so George, Chuma, Professor Mediator, I have those 3, and I don't have your name, sorry, and then that's the 5. Okay, so we go in that order. Yes, George first.
Yeah. Thanks. Very interesting presentations. My question is for Mr. Otieno and Dr. Meroka. Are the recent adjustments to the Kenyan Constitution and the marriage registration laws retroactive in effect? If they are not retroactive in effect, is the problem not overstated? This is particularly because many of the effects, so to say, of woman-to-woman marriage tends to manifest themselves maybe 20, 30, 40 years, down the line, when the children involved have grown up and issues of intestacy or inheritance come up, or when someone has died. So the problems you're going to have in court today in that contest tend to be problems resulting from woman-to-woman marriages contracted several decades ago, and those being contracted today, the problems would probably manifest, decades from now. But if the law is not retroactive, the law governing those relationships should be the law that obtained as at the time the relationships were contracted, So, and then this question is for just Mr. Otieno. You in your discussion of customary dispute settlement in the regions where you did your field work, it's almost as if the customary law system is, hermetically sealed from the regular court, system. That's the way it came across. If those are two completely different systems. There's no nexus. is it not possible for someone, even for instance, a third party, someone who is not a party to the woman-to-woman marriage, but who is an adverse claimant over a piece of property, to make that an issue before the formal court? So that I'm a little bit, I find it hard to understand how it is possible to keep the customary law, the relationship closed to the customary law system, to assume that that's actually where they are going to be settled, or issues arising from it will be settled, regardless of whether the individuals involved in the marriage desire to keep it there or not. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Lichuma, please.
Thank you, and I think wonderful presentations and findings. If I may, just to take up from where Dr. Nyamu posed her question, the aspects in terms of enforcement, enforcement of the law. I personally have challenges with the marriage law and part of the land laws that we amended recently, especially on the gender aspects. When the Attorney General says that marriage must be registered, and he hopes to do this retrospectively, just from what he was saying, the challenge is that there might be certain types of marriage, even if it is man to woman, that may be disadvantaged by the aspects of having them registered. So I have written to the Attorney General really to contest that. I do not think that is the way to go. Similar to the land laws, where we did introduce a section and removed the matrimonial property out of what one can be able to make a claim over. And the challenge is that we were thinking as urban women. We did not get to think as rural women, because in other aspects, there's no other property to the family apart from that, the ancestral land, where you get married. And personally, like if I look at where I'm married, Mr. Lichuma and his family are 9 boys living on a land that nobody knows where the title is. I think it was in the great-grandparents, or if it was never maybe collected, being a first registration. So I think, as I like Dr. Miruka, the analogy you gave of the land, the more you want to dig in and say, let's register, the more you create problems. And in my view, I think we still in the Constitution do recognize customary law. How do we grow this customary law? How do we invest in council of elders? Because without anything against the chiefs who are in the room, they become administrators, but might not be the custodian of customary law. And I stand to be corrected. I'm thinking in terms of communities being encouraged to build their traditional procedures around dispute resolution. For example, we have the Luo Council of Elders, who we have worked with for a while, and now they have started admitting women as part of the elders. So how do we get to improve the structure so that it has the gender aspects of it to take care of both the male and female interest? We also try to work with the Meru elders, what are they called? The Jurinjekes, but they are so tight that they cannot open way for the women to be part of the group. I believe there's a way we can make entry without necessarily trying to think that can we have formal policy around it, can we have legal frameworks around it, and just leave it to the parties that practice it to remain, I like what Catherine said, to remain a silent thing that is recognized within the community that practices it. Because I think there's also a sense of when you open it up to a legal framework, the chances are that communities like myself, my Luya community, that has never practiced this, people will find a way of wanting to encroach on land that belongs to the older people in terms of trying the practice that was initially never part of the practice of that community. So I think my contribution is, can we acknowledge it and leave it to remain a silent practice for the communities that practice it, but encourage that the traditional opinion leaders within the community find the better term for it, find the better way of handling it, especially in areas of dispute. For inheritance, it becomes easy because, like I gave yesterday, the example I gave, our succession law did allow this woman to be a dependent for purposes of inheriting the property. So I think we need to draw the lines in terms of what we want to put on the table. Thank you.
Pass the mic behind you to Professor Diego.
Thank you. This is a very, very interesting area to talk about, and I think I've listened keenly. At first, I've been hearing the practice where I was born and where I've lived, but then I didn't take a special interest in what goes on and why the practice was on. Again, this is because of what one of the speakers there had said about the stigmatization of the practice. And from what I know, again, what I saw was that the children coming out of that, some of them, you try to talk to them and they don't want to associate themselves. Those of them who are still there living now, and I've come across them, they don't want to talk about it. When you try to ask them about whatever they are, their mother or something like that, they don't want to associate themselves with that kind of practice. So it is like they don't belong anywhere, although they are independent and working. But there's that feeling that they don't belong anywhere, and they don't want to be associated with that kind of practice. And all in all, what I've got here is that this is a very, very important practice. It was a mechanism of social control in a number of societies, particularly the society where I am, where it was being practiced. And it was also a mechanism for care of older people, because if you are not fertile, if you are not able to get children for a woman, you are able to get a companion. The man is free. When you are married, the man is free to to live with other women, and you as a woman, you are also free to get other women as a companion, which is very good. Now, my question here is, when some of the studies were done, because this is something which is also secretive, I'm wondering what was the sample size, just to tell us how large is the population of in this kind of practice. How large are they now in Kenya to make us feel it is a concern? I know it is dying, it's almost dying in some areas, but how large is it to make us have that concern that it is a practice that should continue to be there? I know it is good, but we want to see how large it is. Because if we know among the Luya, or not, the Luyas are not practicing, the Nandi, it is so much. Among the Kamba, it is so much. Among the Luya, the number is so much. That in itself can make us have a concern that it is something that we want to see what can be done, and if possible, let the people continue in that practice. The other thing I'm wondering is when Mr. Otieno talked about this attachment to a woman is married and is not having children. Now, my question is, do we have women who are not married and also are married to other women? Are they in existence? And if they do, because I also got some information about the other presenter who said that the roles, I think the two of them talked about the roles of this kind of practice as sexual roles. Now, if it is woman to woman, can it be something which is similar to what is in practice in other countries, the lesbianism? Is there something which is similar in that kind of practice? Which means in Africa, that kind of practice has been there. But we know exactly what the law says of that practice in Kenya today, or the people themselves, what the kind of attitude that people have concerning lesbianism. The other one is Professor talked about, just one now, the professor talked about sharing responsibilities among maybe members of the family or members of the community for older people, so that they can have less responsibility. And we know what has happened where we have had the impact of HIV and AIDS. Most of the people who have survived are these older people. The responsibility is too great. You can find one old lady, 2 or 3 of her sons or daughters have died, and all those children are living with them. How do we share this? How do the members of the community come in to share this, to reduce that responsibility? Or how do other members, because members of the family are gone, she's now the one left to take care of that. How can we do this to share the responsibility to reduce the burden on the older lady? Thank you very much.
Okay, pass the mic to you. Pass the man behind you. The man behind you first. Thank
you. In Korea, we call it nyumba mboka, woman to woman's marriage. Then my question goes, in Korea, it's recognized as a marriage if dowry has been passed. And then we find that in some homes, a woman that wants to marry is very poor, that cannot have dowry to pay. And at the end of the day, if this woman misbehaves, she's thrown away just because the dowry was not paid. How can you help us as judges so that this marriage is recognized even if the dowry is not paid? Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Swale. I am a student of anthropology, Nairobi University. When I first heard about this arrangement a few years back, I got a culture shock. But today I'm happy I've got more insight of what it's all about. I have a brief comment and a question. I believe, or what I have understood, is that the main purpose of this arrangement is about care and how labor is valued or rewarded. If I give you an example, a correlation of, I come from Mombasa, which is predominantly Muslim. When a woman has no children and has some little properties, there are 2 ways of making sure that they get this protection. One, there is an informal arrangement whereby they adopt a young man from the neighborhood or from the family, and that family and that young man will make sure that they do everything for that woman, and in the end of the day, the property will belong to that family or that young man. Number one. Number two, what normally happens is that such a woman will, in court, marry a young woman. And when I say marry, they engage in what we call lesbianism. Although Muslims in Kenya don't want to hear anything about gay and lesbianism, but I think we live in denial. There's a lot of lesbianism in Mombasa and among the Muslims, and this also is working perfectly, although we can't write about it and we can't talk about it. Now, let me come to the question. We have noticed that the government of Kenya for the last few years has introduced a kind of welfare programs like Fund for the Elderly. Okay? And this is working very well for the elderly. And maybe very soon we might have a kind of Obamacare in the name of NHIF or something like that. How does this affect this marriage arrangement? Number two, I would like to think that sometimes this kind of marriage, instead of providing care, work, property, or value for labor, it is denying some intended people to inherit the very property that is channeled to the young girl who have engaged in marriage. Let me give a small example. Many Kenyans are fully aware that we have a very good case of customary law, SM Otieno, and the wife, Wamboi Otieno, who won that case in that customary arrangements. As Wamboi grew older, about to die, I think she made sure that the property wouldn't go back to the Luo community or whatever. He got married to a very young boy to make sure that that property does not go back there. How does this affect this marriage? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That's it was supposed to be 5 questions, but I think we have more like 10 or 15 questions altogether. So I think we'll just have enough time for the panelists to respond. And you can choose.
Yeah, I'll start with some, and then I'll leave the rest that went to you. Shall I? Okay. I'll start with Mildred's, if I may, question. Our studies is qualitative. It's not quantitative. I have no data to know how prevalent the practice is. I don't think Jenny or I have got any studies that have shown that there's ever been any sort of statistically certain, study of the prevalence of the practice. I don't think that work exists. Jenny might correct me if I'm wrong on that.
There's been kind of, I guess, ethnographers that I refer to kind of speculating on the increase, but not on specific numbers.
Yeah, so we don't know the prevalence is the answer to that.
But there are communities where what we are getting is that it used to exist, it's no longer there, like amongst the Kikuyu, and then so I mean it's
changing.
It's changing, yeah. But I think it's hard to say that this is the number of people who are in this arrangement, because just like in any marriage, people come into it and people leave. Mm.
And it's across age spans, so it's about what stage. So I mean, all I can say is that we had no difficulty finding many people that would come and speak to us about it. So that it's clearly not something that is so remote and dying out that it doesn't exist. But we don't have that data about that. On the questions of the issue of sexuality between the two women, it seems to me that, for my purposes, that really doesn't matter. That is not really what the issue is. So, and clearly the practice is, and as the elders and the chiefs explained it to us, that is not it's a heterosexual arrangement in both cases. The woman has been married, the older woman has been married to a man, and the younger woman has heterosexual relationships with another man, but the marriage itself is between two women. So, whether love and affection develops between the two women and it leads to sex, who knows, who cares? I don't care what goes on in the privacy of one's own home. But there's no suggestion to us that that is the purpose or indeed the sexual preference of the people involved. But, I'm not interested in that, and it doesn't seem to me that that's got anything to do with the practice. So that leads on to the questions that others can try to respond to others. What if the dowry is not paid? I think that's a really interesting question, because lying behind these arrangements, it's something that Agnes said, is, what is it about it? What is going on here? What is it for? And what institution are we trying to understand it through? And we're trying to understand it through marriage, aren't we? In some ways. But there's tensions there about whether it is marriage. There's a lot of talk about that, but the law categorises it at the moment through, in the formal legal system, in terms of language and naming, it goes through that, and that's how it's been renamed or rethought. So within the customary practice, dowry is essential for recognition. So if we're taking a sort of legal customary, then dowry is essential for the benefits that are associated with customary marriage to flow. So, you know, it's necessary. If dowry is not paid, then it's challengeable as just a housemaid, a help, a domestic worker, someone that's there. So then you move into, as it were, another way of understanding it. So the challenge is on the boundary. You know, if the dowry is not paid, how do you protect the younger woman that's come in and is doing wifely services, caring, but isn't actually protected by this arrangement? She will be a domestic worker, won't she, legally, or even within... So, you know, I don't know the answer to that, but what it seems to me the research, you know, it's about how we understand and how various things like naming within linguistics, naming within law, forces us to understand and structures how we understand caring. So that's a bit of a sort of an elaborate answer. How does the protections work? Well, we talked about this yesterday. The 2,000 shillings, many of the women, older women that we interview, we ask them about this, and it helps them. If the 2,000 shillings is paid, it's used to provide for the family. So the older woman will use it to provision, to buy things, to pay the school fees, to allow things to happen. It doesn't allow the older woman to pay for care, other than in the arrangement. It bolsters what care is there. It makes life easier and the tension's less, but it doesn't substitute it. And yes, this marriage, this arrangement, because it's recognised, denies other people inheritance. Absolutely. So if you are somebody that wants to challenge and you say, hey, you know, we've lost out because this is a second marriage and we're not going to get something, then that's true. But that's true of any marriage, second marriage in a sense, in terms of the challenges. So it will deny others if it's recognised, because it's an access to property. But that's the nature of it.
I think I'll just start off by saying that where this union, where dowry has not been paid, if we look at what happens between the union of a man and a woman and dowry is not paid, what happens in that situation? Where I come from, say if the man dies before he paid dowry, then his kin normally would have to, isn't it, fulfill obligations. Otherwise, he will have to be buried as a man who did not have children, and so on, yeah? So I believe in customary law systems, there are protections that recognize this sorts of arrangement. The problem is that when we go to court and then they're challenged, we place a greater burden on women who've been in a woman-to-woman marriage, and we sort of put them in a situation where sort of, you know, the customs don't apply to you, but then also the formal law not quite. But customary law, if it was to be applied in the sense that this is a marriage and a customary law, then precisely that's what will happen, that if the older woman had not paid the dowry and she has taken a younger woman, what stops this union from being regularized post-mortem, as it were? It can actually be regularized after the older woman has died. It's only that, it's so fluid, and I said this to Anne, it's so fluid, both under customary law and even in formal law, and I think it's fluid because of the naming, this stigma that, you know, we whisper, it's in very, you know, that one is, she's in this, you know, and so there's that stigma. But truly, I believe the protections are there under customary law, because under customary law, it is a marriage for all intents and purposes. And this then goes to what we believe marriage to be when we attach the meanings of marriage. And you see, for those of us who are interested in family law, a marriage has what do we call it? The ingredients that make up the marriage, yeah? Mm. So there has to be consummation. There has to be, yes, consent. You have to have lived together and stuff like that. Affinity. And the affinity, yes. But for the woman-to-woman marriage, those might not necessarily be the ingredients or the building blocks.
So we have to accept it for what it is. What exactly makes it a marriage? There might be no consummation. And if there is consummation between the two women, well, in Kenya that would, yes, it will be an offense. So basically I think it is in the naming and all this, and then that intersection between formality and our customary law systems, as it were. And yes, I do. The question as to whether the Constitution and the Marriage Act apply retrospectively, the regulations that were passed earlier this year are actually to all marriages. So if you're married under customary law at the moment, you need to register that particular union, even if you got married 20 years ago. If you don't, there will be challenges that arise later on in.
Okay, before we get a steps in of an announcement, somebody's car is blocking someone else who needs to leave. So if you're the owner or driver of KCM 699F, would you please go and move that car? KCM 699F.
Shaming somebody in the car.
All right, yeah.
So I'll respond to a couple of issues. Now, Professor raised the question of whether the two systems are separate, like customary justice systems and state justice systems are separate, and whether they can work together. I think in the context of woman-to-woman marriages, the customary systems are better, because the doctrines of the formal systems do not recognize, the intricacies involved in these marriages. So, for instance, there is a popular case called Maria Gisesa versus Grace Nyomenda, in which the Court of Appeal actually ruled, the High Court then, I think, no, the Court of Appeal ruled that these marriages were, unjust and repugnant to justice. So the question is, when you test them against formal law, and particularly the principle of repugnancy test, then they fail.
No, they don't.
In other words, a lot of courts, a lot of judges who have a very, what do I call it, conservative understanding of the law would say, look, these cases, these marriages may not, meet this particular test of repugnancy. So the problem in the mainstream courts, in my view, is that the repugnancy test and the doctrine of precedent that are applicable in formal systems are, not good for this kind of marriages. So I think ultimately the cases may end in formal justice systems, but we need to get there as a form of an appeal rather than as a form of original jurisdiction. Now the second issue that I would also raise is the question of within these marriages there are protection systems. Now, for instance, when you looked at the Kipsigis, there are certain oaths that are taken when these marriages are done, and we notice that among them these things are done at night. And part of the agreement is that you will not leave, and if you have a conflict, then there is usually a woman who presides over this process, and then they put the synendet, this one that the Kalenjin put in when they win races, the green leaves. So when conflict develops, then the first person to intervene is that woman who helped in this particular process. So before it even gets to the chief, there is an inbuilt family structure, so that the chief is even the elders and the chief are secondary to the process. So I think that inbuilt mechanisms through which disputes are addressed, and we need to. I'm not saying that the state system is bad, but I'm thinking we need to exhaust these local systems first before examining the state system. And even if the state system is to be used, then it has to take serious consideration of the dynamics within the customary processes. Now, the other question is the question of land. Let me revisit it again. It has been said here a number of times that the land registration is a fairly recent matter. So it basically dates back to about 1954. Now the question is, before then, the question of land ownership, both women and men had, usufruct rights to land. So they could use land. Both of them were entitled to land. So it is that registration process that messed up. So for me, culture is not inconsistent with women's rights. I think we need to decolonize culture, remove the colonial elements of culture. Because discrimination of women over land inheritance is not a cultural, it's not a historical reality in Africa. It's a product of, colonial experiences. So instead of talking about, this, because when disputes arise in these woman-to-woman marriages, it comes because the young woman comes in and she's told, this is your land. She's not given the title deed. The land, as was pointed out by Dr. Celestine, is probably in the title of great-great-grandfather. So it would be ridiculous for you to say, you are giving me this land. Can you now give me the title? So that is impossible. But once the older woman dies, now she cannot put a formal claim in court because she does not have a title. But then the process through which she came into this marriage did not require a title because, she came and she knows even in her family that when you are given land, you're simply shown this particular piece is yours. So the requirements in court, and when we went to Migori, we found a woman who had a lot of these problems where the courts would want registration documents like titles and so on. But she doesn't have them. But she has been cultivating that land over time. So customary structures would recognize that. But the law would a lot of times require, some form of proof and a very high threshold of evidence that these women a lot of times may not have. Now, yeah, let me just wind up. Now, the other thing that then just on my issue of decolonizing culture still within this context of woman marriages. Now, when we went to the Kalenjin, we found when a son is born in a woman-to-woman marriage, he's called Arab Chedioset, meaning he comes from the lineage of a woman. Now, the British conception of naming requires that you have two names, one being a Christian name and another one being, a traditional name.
Masculine.
So, a woman married to another woman, you'd have a lot of them taking up the names of the older women as their names. And so this is problematic on the basis that, it raises a lot of stigma because from your identity card somebody can easily prove you are married to a woman, and if you're interacting with somebody who is not from that community, then that is obviously very discriminating. But again, even the sons, because now you are called Arab Chepkwony, meaning you are from the lineage of a woman, or Arab Kogo among the Nandi, meaning you are from the lineage of a woman, or Arab Chebioset from the Kipsigis, all these identities point to a particular direction. So I think that if we go back to the way we used to name people before, without requiring that they have their parents' names in the identity document, because this is a fairly recent phenomenon, then we can reduce the discrimination around this marriage.
True. Okay, there is one question about the research that you haven't answered.
Yes.
Professor Rebecca asked, did you find any incidents of a single woman who takes on a younger woman?
Yes. Now,
yes, we did. We did. We met, as David said, the only cases that was when it was a mother taking on a daughter, a biological daughter. We found, but we didn't find. Did we get any? No, I think probably because of the locations in which we did it. So we weren't doing it in the locations where Bart Razora did his in Tanzania. So we weren't looking at where it was. No. Some of the women, a few of the women, older women, were wealthy and had businesses in Nairobi, and their practices were slightly different. So they clearly were exercising much more autonomy over the arrangement than the women that had either living husbands and so on. So they were doing it much more explicitly for the reasons we heard yesterday, which was for independent women to gain care and an arrangement. So they were much more autonomous because they had more access to the formal, business women who had their younger wives. But we didn't have anybody that we identified as single women.
But just to add to what Anna said, a couple, I remember when we went to Kitui, a lot of the women told us that, my partner is in Nairobi. And when we asked them, does he have a man in Nairobi? They couldn't, they were not sure about that. But they had not seen the man back home. So, the problem is this was not the direction of the research, so we were not really
we weren't particularly looking at that.
If you look at the work of Ngaruya, so she writes about it among the two, so we do have, it may be more quiet or less prevalent, but it is.
Yeah, we have more difficulty accessing the Kikuyu. Thank you.
But and then the work of Fiona Mackenzie, also in the same community in Murang'a. It was mostly actually women who were independent, single, never married, or had been widowed and then subsequently decided to take on.
Yeah.
I think most of the questions have been answered, but let me say this about what was asked about lesbianism. Among the groups that we worked with, number one, it is a taboo. Now, whether it goes on underground, it's actually very hard to tell. But what we managed to then construct out of their talk and everything, as I said before, this younger woman is actually the daughter-in-law. In fact, the father, because a woman can have her husband and then still go and get for herself aniweto. This father cannot touch that girl. It is a taboo, and you know it in our customs that you don't go to your daughter-in-law and do stuff. So the very naming for us then counted that out. Maybe I can leave it at that. And in terms of how prevalent it is, again, also ours was a qualitative study, in depth, and so we didn't check how many. Like you asked, how many people are involved in that? But we know it is going on. In fact, I was so shocked. Later on, I was like, that is a son of Maiweto, that one. And I was like, hello. When I wanted details, nobody wanted to talk. Now everybody was beginning to tell me, and it was like quite open. I mean, not open, but quite prevalent in the villages. But a study needs to be done to know how prevalent. How will they cut that out? Maybe our good chiefs would help us. Maybe they know families where they have this, and then it can be documented. But normally, even to get those women to sit down and talk about their lives is just a huge issue. Like, I needed to take photographs, maybe do videos, but I didn't because it was too intrusive. And so I had to have them trust me to just talk without too much, and maybe with a smaller tape. And with a lot of permission, can I really tape what we are talking about, and so on and so forth, and then to pick the things that we picked. Anyway, somebody mentioned about the older women who have been left with orphaned children of their children, and so how does that play out? I think maybe it's because of the breakdown of our values, because, as I said before, in our customs and in our cultures, if you ask me about my father, actually I have 5 fathers, because my father's father is my father, and his brother, all those are my fathers. And so it shouldn't be that this woman, this older woman who has been left with these orphans, should be taking care of those by herself. I think generally we should be digging back into our practices of the wider family rather than the unit, the nuclear family. And it would really help, but I don't know. But that's that's what I think. I like what you said, Commissioner, that to a large extent, in terms of when we're thinking about how we deal with the legal issues, how we bring this into law and so on and so forth, I think to a large extent then, we should farm the court of the elders and whatever else is there. I know you mentioned that the Meru, what are they called? Yeah, those ones. They don't allow the women in, and I think it happens in many other communities. And so we should be able to find, like we did in health, because in health, we had a lot of problems with women when they were giving birth, child care and all that, and we began to train the local midwives. Maybe we should have people who can begin to be trained to know some of these aspects of the society so that we can deal with it, and those then can be recognized by the state courts, and so that when they have seen where the boundaries are for the lands, or who's married to who, then we can handle that. I don't know. I was thinking it is really a matter of going back to our roots, and much as a lot has changed, I think we can still borrow from our elders what they had before. And that's what you are also saying, that in dispute resolution, they were able to go back before they ever came to the chief. Maybe we should recognize that much more than we've done before.
Okay, finally, Jenny, and then a good half an hour late.
Yes, I don't really have much to say that's already been answered, except to say that based on what I read in kind of the early literature, the role of the state is really important in terms of being wary of the state in terms of, because it was criminalized. Woman-to-woman marriage was criminalized during the colonial period because it was seen as repugnant. So kind of that, I guess the wariness has historical precedent, I suppose. And I guess my other comment, which of course is not, it's coming from an outside perspective, but I guess I guess culture is fluid, and I guess is there a sense in which if it's only at the customary level where these marriages are, I probably did maybe challenging what David was saying about just having the customary level, because there's provisions in the Constitution about gender equality, and how do we decolonize the cultural level? Like, how do we actually do that without, maybe there's still hangovers from the colonial time? And also, I mean, the Regina Aboler, who did, decades of ethnographic study among the Nandi, very grounded research, she was saying how, while colonialism and capitalism had really exacerbated the challenges women faced, they had also faced challenges, traditional challenges as well. So it's always complex, the challenges facing women on a cultural level, and also, of course, the influence of colonialism was possibly the worst of everything, but I just wanted to add that.
Thank you. I think we'll be forgiven for taking a lot of time, but we can see there was a need for a lot of discussion. I'm sure the who had questions they never got to ask. You can still catch these presenters at tea break or whatever and ask your questions.
Sorry. I was going to say we're all right because, in a sense, we're a bit ahead of schedule anyway. So we've got until 12:45 after we've had our tea break to have discussions in small groups to take this forward, so we can reflect more on, are there key issues relating to women and women marriage. The discussion we've had here can continue in small groups, and I think we should allow people to organise their own small groups today. Do you think?
I think so.
Yeah, so just go yourself into a group that you would like to go in say 4 groups and have discussions. But I mean, we've got that time after the tea break to do that and think about what issues are raised. And I think issues are raised, 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 and I think issues are